Welcome to another journey into the drowsy realm of ancient myths, where heroes move like shadows through moonlit adventures and gods whisper secrets that echo through eternity. Tonight we drift into the story of Perseus, a tale that begins with prophecy and ends with tragedy, winding through impossible quests and divine interventions like a river flowing toward the sea. As you settle into comfort, let your breathing slow and your thoughts soften, for we are about to visit the Bronze Age kingdoms of Greece, where fate weaves its intricate patterns, and even kings cannot escape what the gods have written in the stars. Close your eyes and let the gentle current of this ancient story carry you toward peaceful sleep. In the ancient city of Argos, where olive trees cast their silver shadows across marble courtyards, and the Mediterranean sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber, there lived a king whose heart grew heavier with each passing year. King Acrisius ruled his people justly and well, but deep in his chest lived a worry that gnawed at him like a persistent tide wearing away at coastal stones. He had no sons, only a daughter named Danaë, whose beauty was spoken of in whispers throughout the kingdom, compared to golden dawn breaking over distant mountains and to starlight dancing on calm water. The king's greatest fear was not war or famine or plague, but something far more personal and immediate. He feared death, as many mortals do. But more than that, he feared dying without leaving a male heir to carry on his bloodline and rule Argos. After his bones had turned to dust beneath the earth, this worry consumed his thoughts during the long afternoons, when he sat in his throne room listening to petitioners, and it haunted his dreams when he lay sleepless in the royal chamber, staring up at painted ceilings that depicted heroes and gods in their eternal struggles. One morning, when the air was thick with the scent of jasmine and the distant sound of sheep bells drifted across the hills, King Acrisius made a decision that would change everything. He would journey to the oracle at Delphi, that sacred place where the gods spoke through the lips of a priestess who breathed sweet vapors rising from deep cracks in the earth. The oracle could see into the shadowy realm of the future, where mortal eyes could not penetrate, and perhaps she could tell him whether he would ever have the son he so desperately desired. The journey to Delphi took many days, winding through mountain passes where eagles soared on thermal currents and ancient pine trees whispered secrets to the wind. When at last Acrisius reached the sacred precinct, he felt the presence of something vast and unknowable pressing down upon him like the weight of the sky itself. The priestess, known as the Pythia, sat upon her three-legged stool above the sacred chasm, her eyes rolled back until only the whites showed, her voice speaking words that seemed to come from somewhere far beyond the world of daylight and ordinary concerns. The oracle's words, when they came, fell upon the king's ears like stones dropping into a still pool, sending ripples of dread spreading outward through his entire being. The oracle's voice had been like cold wind blowing through empty chambers when she delivered her prophecy to King Acrisius. She had spoken of death coming not from foreign armies or divine wrath, but from his own bloodline, telling him that no son would ever be born to him, but that his daughter's child would one day strike him down and claim his throne. The words echoed in the king's mind during his long journey home, growing heavier with each mile, until they felt like chains wrapped around his chest, making every breath a struggle against an invisible weight. When Acrisius returned to Argos, he looked upon his daughter Danaë with new eyes, seeing not the beloved child who had brought him such joy throughout her youth, but a vessel for the doom that would eventually destroy him. She was more beautiful than ever, her hair catching sunlight like spun gold, and her laughter ringing through the palace corridors like silver bells. But now every smile she gave him felt like a reminder of the fate that awaited him. He watched her from shadows and doorways, studying her movements as she tended to her garden or sat weaving at her loom, wondering which young man might catch her attention and become the father of his destroyer. The solution, when it came to him, seemed both terrible and perfect in its simplicity. If Danaë never married, she could never bear the child who would kill him. If no man could reach her, no grandson could be conceived to fulfill the oracle's dark promise. And so King Acrisius summoned his finest architects and builders, commissioning them to construct something that had never before been built in all the kingdoms of Greece. The tower rose from the palace grounds like a finger pointing accusingly at the heavens, built entirely of polished bronze that gleamed like fire in the afternoon sun and grew cold as winter stone. When night fell across the land, it stood 4 stories high, with walls so thick that no sound from outside could penetrate them, and no windows except for a single opening at the very top that looked out only at the endless sky. The bronze had been forged in furnaces that burned hotter than dragon's breath, then shaped by craftsmen whose hammers rang against metal like thunder echoing through mountain valleys. Inside this gleaming prison, Acrisius installed everything his daughter might need for a life of perpetual isolation. Soft carpets covered the floors in patterns of blue and gold, and tapestries depicting peaceful scenes of shepherds and their flocks hung upon the walls. There were shelves lined with scrolls containing the greatest poems and stories ever written, and a loom where Danaë could create her own beautiful fabrics. Servants brought meals through the single door, which was locked with 7 bronze keys that only the king himself possessed, and they were forbidden to speak to the princess or to carry any messages between her and the outside world. Years passed in the bronze tower like water flowing slowly through narrow channels, each day blending into the next until Danaë could no longer remember what her life had been like before the walls closed around her. She had grown from a young woman into someone whose beauty had ripened like fruit left too long in the sun, becoming something almost otherworldly in its perfection. The isolation had not dimmed her radiance, but had instead concentrated it, like sunlight focused through a crystal, until it could set fire to whatever it touched. From her single window, she could see only a small circle of sky that changed color with the hours, showing her pale dawn light that gradually deepened into the rich blue of afternoon, before fading to the deep purple of evening. She learned to tell time by watching clouds drift across her limited view, and she came to know the phases of the moon better than any astronomer in the kingdom. Sometimes birds would perch on the narrow ledge outside her window, and she would speak to them softly, pretending they carried her words to the world beyond her bronze walls. Zeus, king of the gods, had been watching Danaë for many months from his throne high on Mount Olympus. He had first noticed her during one of his wanderings across the mortal world, when her laughter had floated up to the heavens like incense from a temple altar. The sight of her imprisoned beauty stirred something deep within his immortal heart, and he found himself returning again and again to observe her solitary life. She would sit by her window in the afternoons, her golden hair catching what little sunlight managed to reach her, and Zeus felt drawn to her loneliness like a moth drawn to a candle flame. But the bronze tower presented a challenge even for the king of the gods. Its walls were too thick for him to penetrate in his usual form, and the single window was too small for even the cleverest divine transformation. Zeus considered taking the shape of an eagle or a swan, as he had done when courting other mortal women, but neither form would allow him to reach the isolated princess. For weeks he circled the tower in various disguises, growing more frustrated with each failed attempt, until finally inspiration struck him like lightning, illuminating a storm-darkened landscape. On an afternoon when the air hung heavy and still, as if the world itself were holding its breath in anticipation, Zeus gathered his power and transformed himself into something that no wall could keep out, and no door could bar. He became pure light, dissolving his divine essence into countless droplets of liquid gold that sparkled like captured starlight. This golden rain began to fall through Danaë's window in a shower, so fine it seemed like mist made of precious metal, each droplet warm against her skin and glowing with an inner fire that spoke of divine origin. Danaë stood transfixed as the golden shower surrounded her, feeling the warm droplets settle on her arms and shoulders like blessings from the sky itself. The light seemed to seep into her very being, filling her with a strange joy that she had never experienced before. 9 months after the golden rain had visited her tower, Danaë gave birth to a son in the quiet hours before dawn, when the world lay wrapped in grey mist and even the birds had not yet begun their morning songs. The child emerged into the world without crying, his eyes already bright with an intelligence that seemed far too knowing for someone who had just drawn his first breath. She held him close to her chest, feeling his tiny heart beating against hers, like a small drum echoing in the bronze chamber, and she knew instinctively that this was no ordinary child, but something touched by divine power. She named him Perseus, a name that came to her lips as naturally as water flows downhill, though she could not say why this particular collection of sounds seemed so perfectly suited to the small being in her arms. The child seemed to glow with an inner light that reminded her of the golden rain that had fallen through her window so many months before. And when she looked into his eyes, she saw depths that spoke of sea storms and mountain peaks and all the wild places of the world that she had never been allowed to see. For weeks she managed to keep the baby's existence hidden from the servants who brought her meals, feeding him from her own body and wrapping him in soft cloths torn from her finest robes. She created a small nest for him in the corner of her chamber where the shadows fell deepest during the day, and she sang to him in whispers so soft they were barely louder than the sound of her own breathing. The songs were ones her mother had sung to her long ago, before the bronze walls had separated her from everything she had once known and loved. Perseus grew with supernatural speed, as if time moved differently for him than it did for ordinary mortals. Within a month he was sitting up and reaching for objects with hands that seemed unusually strong for such a small child. His laughter, when it came, was like the sound of silver water bubbling over smooth stones, and it filled the bronze chamber with a warmth that no fire could have provided. Danaë found herself talking to him constantly, describing the small circle of sky she could see from her window, and telling him stories about the world beyond their prison walls. But keeping a growing child secret in such a confined space proved impossible for very long. Perseus began to babble and cuckoo with increasing volume, his voice carrying further than Danaë could control, despite her attempts to muffle the sounds. She fashioned toys for him from scraps of cloth and pieces of thread, but he seemed more interested in reaching toward the window where sunlight filtered through, as if he already understood that somewhere beyond those bronze walls lay a larger world waiting to be explored. The servants began to notice strange sounds coming from the tower during their daily visits, and though they said nothing to the princess herself, their curious glances lingered longer than before. Danaë could see questions forming in their eyes, and she knew that soon those questions would find their way to the king's ears, like seeds carried on the wind to take root in fertile ground. King Acrisius had been having strange dreams for weeks, visions that left him restless and filled with a nameless dread that clung to him like morning fog refusing to lift from the valleys. In these dreams he saw golden light streaming through bronze walls and heard the sound of infant laughter echoing from impossible places. He would wake with his heart pounding against his ribs, like a caged bird desperate for freedom. and he would lie staring at the painted ceiling of his chamber until the first rays of sunlight crept across the marble floor. The whispers of his servants reached him gradually, like water seeping through tiny cracks in a dam, until the pressure became too great to ignore. They spoke of sounds drifting from the bronze tower, of shadows moving in ways that seemed to suggest more than one person lived within those gleaming walls. At first Acrisius dismissed these reports as the idle gossip of bored palace workers, but as the stories grew more frequent and more detailed, a cold certainty began to settle in his stomach, like a stone dropped into deep water. On a morning when the air was crisp with the promise of approaching winter and the olive trees in the palace gardens had begun to shed their silver leaves, King Acrisius made his way to the bronze tower with steps that grew heavier with each pace. He carried the 7 bronze keys on a ring that jangled softly against his thigh, the sound marking time like a funeral march as he climbed the narrow stone steps that led to his daughter's prison. The tower seemed to loom above him more ominously than usual, its polished surface reflecting the pale sky in ways that made it appear almost alive. He unlocked the 7 locks with hands that trembled slightly, despite his attempts to maintain royal composure, each key turning with a click that seemed to echo through the chamber beyond. When the bronze door finally swung open on its silent hinges, Acrisius stepped inside to find his daughter sitting by the window, with something small and precious cradled in her arms. The sight struck him with the force of a physical blow, confirming his worst fears while simultaneously revealing something he had not expected to feel. The child in Danaë's arms was beautiful beyond description, with skin that seemed to glow with inner light and eyes that held depths of wisdom far beyond his tender age. Perseus looked up at his grandfather with no trace of fear, only curiosity, as if he were studying some interesting specimen that had wandered into his limited world. In that moment, Acrisius felt his heart torn between 2 opposing forces. Love for this perfect grandchild warring against terror of the prophecy that had shaped every decision he had made for years. Danaë looked up at her father with eyes that held no shame or apology, only a quiet dignity that reminded him of the young woman she had been before he had locked her away from the world. She spoke no words of explanation or excuse, understanding that the time for secrets had passed, like winter giving way to spring, inevitable and final. The decision came to King Acrisius in the sleepless hours after midnight, when the palace lay wrapped in darkness, and only the distant sound of waves breaking against the harbour walls disturbed the silence. He could not bring himself to kill his daughter or his grandson with his own hands, for, despite his fear of the prophecy, some part of him still remembered the joy Danaë had brought to his life before the oracle's words had poisoned everything with dread. Yet neither could he allow them to remain in Argos, where the child would grow to fulfill the doom that had been foretold since before his first breath. The solution he conceived was one that would place their fate in the hands of the gods themselves, removing the burden of their deaths from his conscience while still ensuring that the prophecy could never come to pass. He would have them placed in a chest and set adrift upon the wine-dark sea, letting the waves and winds decide whether they lived or died. If the gods wished them to survive, they would provide some miracle of rescue, and if not, the sea would claim them as it had claimed so many others throughout the long history of mortals who had dared to challenge fate. The chest was crafted by the finest woodworkers in the kingdom, built from cedar planks that had been seasoned for years, until they were hard as stone and sealed with pitch, until no drop of water could penetrate their joints. It was large enough to hold both mother and child with room for the supplies that might sustain them for a few days upon the open ocean. Though Acrisius knew in his heart that few days would likely be all they had. The interior was lined with soft wool and furnished with cushions stuffed with the finest down, as if comfort in their final hours might somehow absolve him of the cruelty he was about to commit. On the morning chosen for their departure, a grey dawn that seemed drained of all colour and warmth, palace guards came to escort Danaë, Faye and Perseus from the bronze tower to the harbour where their wooden prison waited. The princess walked with her head held high, carrying her son against her chest while her bare feet made no sound upon the cold stone steps. She had woven a cloak from the finest threads in her chamber, dyed deep blue like the depths of the ocean that would soon surround them, and wrapped around her shoulders it gave her the appearance of some sea goddess walking among mortals. The people of Argos gathered along the harbour to witness this strange spectacle, though none dared speak openly of what they saw. Some wept silently for the beautiful princess who had once been the pride of their kingdom, while others muttered prayers to Poseidon, asking the sea god to show mercy to the innocent child who had never done harm to anyone. King Acrisius stood upon the marble steps of the harbour temple, his face carved from stone and his eyes fixed upon some distant point beyond the horizon, where sky met water in an endless line of blue. The chest was loaded carefully onto a small boat that would carry it beyond the harbour walls to where the deep currents would catch it and bear it away from sight. Danaë stepped inside with Perseus still in her arms, settling herself among the cushions with the same grace she had once shown when taking her place at royal banquets in happier times. The chest drifted upon the Mediterranean waves for 3 days and 3 nights, carried by currents that seemed guided by invisible hands toward a destination known only to the gods who watched from their thrones above the clouds. Inside their wooden prison, Danaë held Perseus close to her heart and sang to him in whispers, the same lullabies her mother had once sung to her when she was small, and the world had seemed full of nothing but warmth and safety. The baby never cried during their journey, as if he understood that silence was necessary for their survival, though his bright eyes continued to watch everything around him with that same unsettling intelligence. On the 3rd morning, when the sun rose like a golden coin tossed into the eastern sky, the chest came to rest in the nets of Dictys, a fisherman who worked the waters around the island of Seriphos. He had been casting his nets in the same spot where his father and grandfather had fished before him, following schools of silver fish that moved through these waters like living clouds beneath the surface. When his nets grew suddenly heavy with something far larger than any fish he had ever caught, Dictys pulled with all his strength until the mysterious cargo broke the surface of the water. The sight of the cedar chest bobbing among his nets filled the fisherman with wonder and not a little fear, for in his years upon the sea he had learned that the ocean sometimes delivered gifts that were more curse than blessing. But something about the way the morning light played across the polished wood convinced him that this was no ordinary piece of wreckage washed up from some distant shipwreck. He hauled the chest aboard his small boat with the help of rope and pulleys, his weathered hands working quickly, despite the trembling that had begun in his fingers. When Dictys pried open the bronze locks that held the chest closed, the sight that greeted him was like something from a dream woven by the gods themselves. The beautiful woman inside looked up at him with eyes that held depths of sorrow and gratitude in equal measure, while the child in her arms gazed at him with a directness that made the fisherman feel as if his very soul were being examined and found worthy. Neither mother nor child appeared to be harmed by their ordeal, though their clothes were damp with sea spray and their hair was tangled with salt. Dictys was a simple man who had spent his life pulling fish from the sea and mending nets under the Mediterranean sun. But he recognized divinity when he saw it, and he knew that these two had been placed in his path by powers far greater than his own understanding. Without asking questions about who they were or why they had been set adrift in a chest upon the waves, he wrapped them both in his own cloak and rowed toward the harbour of Seriphos with strong, steady strokes that sent his boat cutting through the water like a blade through silk. The island of Seriphos was a place of rocky shores and olive groves, where goats wandered freely among the wild thyme and fishermen shared their catches with neighbors who had become like family over generations of shared labor and celebration. Here, Dictys reasoned, a woman and child could find sanctuary among people who valued kindness over curiosity, and who would ask no uncomfortable questions about the past that had brought them to this place. The years that followed flowed by like gentle tides, each season bringing subtle changes to the small house by the harbour where Danaë and Perseus had made their home. Dictys had given them a cottage that faced the sea, its whitewashed walls bright against the blue sky, and its small garden filled with herbs that perfumed the air with scents of rosemary and sage. The fishermen asked for nothing in return, except the pleasure of their company during the long evenings, when the day's work was done, and the harbour grew quiet except for the soft lapping of waves against the stone pier. Perseus grew from a beautiful child into a young man whose strength seemed to increase with each passing month, as if the divine blood that flowed in his veins was finally beginning to assert itself after years of quiet dormancy. He learned to swim in the crystal waters around Seriphos before he could properly walk, moving through the sea with the grace of a dolphin and holding his breath for lengths of time that amazed even the most experienced pearl divers among the island's inhabitants. The local fishermen began to speak of him in whispers, noting how the fish seemed to gather around him when he entered the water and how storms would calm when he stood upon the shore. By day he helped Dictys with his nets, and learned the ancient art of reading weather patterns in cloud formations and wave movements. But by night he would sit with his mother on the terrace of their cottage, and listen as she told him stories of the great heroes who had walked the earth in ages past. She spoke of Heracles and his 12 labours, of Theseus and the Minotaur, of Jason and his quest for the Golden Fleece. And with each tale Perseus felt something stirring deep within his chest, a restless energy that seemed to grow stronger as the moon waxed and waned above their peaceful island home. The other inhabitants of Seriphos had long since stopped wondering about the mysterious woman and her remarkable son who had appeared among them as if delivered by the gods themselves. Danaë had proven herself to be skilled in the healing arts, able to mend broken bones and cure fevers with mixtures of herbs and gentle words that seemed to carry power beyond their simple meaning. The island's children flocked to her cottage when they scraped their knees or suffered from nightmares, and she would tend to them with the patience of someone who understood that small hurts could feel as large as the world to those who suffered them. Perseus, meanwhile, had become something of a local legend for his feats of strength and courage. He could lift stones that would require 3 ordinary men to move, and he had saved several fishing boats from being dashed against the rocks during sudden storms by swimming out into dangerous waters and guiding them to safety with his own hands. The young women of the island watched him with admiring eyes, but he seemed unaware of their attention. His gaze always turned toward distant horizons, as if he were listening for some call that only he could hear. As his 20th birthday approached, Perseus began to experience dreams that felt more real than waking life. Visions of bronze towers and golden rain, and a destiny that called to him from across the wine-dark sea. The king of Seriphos lived in a palace that was modest compared to the great royal residences of the mainland, but impressive enough for an island whose wealth came from fishing and the occasional cargo ship that stopped to take on fresh water and supplies. Polydectes was a man in the prime of his years, with dark hair touched by silver at the temples and eyes that held the calculating intelligence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted through a combination of charm and carefully applied pressure. He had ruled Seriphos for more than a decade with a firm, but generally fair hand, and his subjects respected him even if they did not always love him, the way they loved his gentle brother Dictys. For months, the king had been watching Danaë from a distance, studying her movements as she walked through the village market, or tended to her garden in the early morning hours when the light was soft and golden. Her beauty had not dimmed with the passing years, but had instead ripened into something even more compelling, like wine that has been aged until it reaches perfect maturity. The way she carried herself spoke of noble breeding, and the grace with which she performed even the simplest tasks suggested that she had been raised in circumstances far grander than her current humble cottage by the sea. The mystery surrounding her origins only added to her appeal in Polydectes' eyes, for he was a man who enjoyed puzzles and took pleasure in solving riddles that others found too complex or dangerous to unravel. He had made discreet inquiries about the woman who had appeared in his kingdom 20 years ago, but the fisherman who might have known something about her arrival had proven surprisingly reluctant to share their knowledge. Even his own brother Dictys, normally the most talkative of men when it came to island gossip, grew silent and evasive whenever the conversation turned to his mysterious houseguests. What troubled Polydectes more than Danaë's unknown past was the presence of her son Perseus, whose reputation for strength and courage had begun to spread beyond Seriphos to neighboring islands where merchants and sailors carried tales of the young hero's extraordinary abilities. The king had observed Perseus during the harvest festivals and athletic competitions that marked the changing seasons, and he had seen enough to know that the young man possessed power that could pose a threat to anyone who might wish to oppose him. More concerning still was the obvious devotion between mother and son, a bond so strong that Polydectes knew Perseus would never allow anyone to harm Danaë while he drew breath. The solution to this problem had been growing in the king's mind like a seed planted in fertile soil, watered by desire and nurtured by cunning until it blossomed into a plan that would serve all his purposes at once. If he could find some way to send Perseus away from Seriphos on a quest that would either win the young man great glory or lead to his death in some distant land, the path would be clear for him to court Danaë without interference. The trick would be finding a quest dangerous enough to remove Perseus permanently, while still appealing to the young hero's obvious hunger for adventure and renown. As spring turned toward summer, and the fishing boats returned each evening heavy with their catches, Polydectes began to formulate the details of his scheme, crafting it with the same careful attention he might give to planning a military campaign or negotiating a complex trade agreement. The great hall of Polydectes' palace had been transformed for the occasion, its stone walls draped with tapestries that depicted scenes of heroic deeds and divine interventions, while long tables groaned under the weight of roasted lambs and freshly caught fish prepared with herbs that filled the air with savory aromas. Torches burned in bronze sconces along the walls, casting dancing shadows that made the woven figures in the tapestries seem to move with lives of their own, and musicians played soft melodies on lyres whose strings had been tuned to match the sound of waves breaking gently against distant shores. All the noble families of Seriphos had been invited to this feast, along with visiting dignitaries from neighboring islands and wealthy merchants whose ships regularly called at the harbor. The purpose of the gathering, as announced by royal proclamation several weeks earlier, was for King Polydectes to formally declare his intention to take a wife, and to hear the proposals of marriage that various fathers wished to make on behalf of their eligible daughters. It was, by all accounts, to be a celebration of new beginnings and the continuation of royal bloodlines, though some of the older inhabitants of the island detected undercurrents in the king's manner that suggested his true motivations might be more complex than they appeared. Perseus had been reluctant to attend the feast, preferring the simple pleasures of helping Dictys repair nets and watching the sunset paint the sea in shades of gold and crimson. But his mother had insisted that it would be discourteous to refuse the king's invitation. She had dressed in her finest robe a garment of deep blue silk that she had woven years ago during the long nights when sleep would not come and her hands needed occupation to quiet her troubled thoughts. The colour brought out the gold in her hair and made her eyes seem as deep and mysterious as the sea itself. And when she entered the great hall with Perseus at her side, conversation ceased as if a spell had been cast over the assembled guests. Polydectes rose from his throne with a smile that seemed warm enough to melt winter snow, but Perseus noticed how the king's eyes fixed immediately upon his mother, and lingered there with an intensity that made something cold twist in the young man's stomach. The formal presentations began with great ceremony, each father stepping forward to speak of his daughter's virtues and the dowry he was prepared to offer, while the young women in question sat with downcast eyes and cheeks coloured with the pink of barely contained embarrassment. Some of the proposals were generous enough to draw murmurs of approval from the crowd, while others were so modest that they elicited barely polite acknowledgement from the throne. But as the evening wore on and cup after cup of wine was consumed by the increasingly boisterous guests, it became clear that King Polydectes was paying little attention to any of the formal proposals being made. His gaze continued to drift toward the table where Danaë sat beside her son, and when he finally rose to address the assembly, his words carried a weight that seemed to settle over the hall, like a heavy blanket thrown over a sleeping child. The king announced that while he was honoured by all the generous offers that had been made, his heart had already been claimed by a woman whose beauty and grace surpassed all others in his kingdom. He spoke of love that had grown slowly over many seasons, like olive trees reaching toward the sun, and of his desire to offer protection and honour to one who had already proven herself worthy of the highest respect. The silence that followed King Polydectes' declaration stretched through the great hall, like shadows lengthening at sunset, heavy with unspoken understanding, and the kind of tension that makes even brave men shift uncomfortably in their seats. Perseus felt the meaning of the king's words settle over him like a net cast by an expert fisherman, and though no name had been spoken aloud, every eye in the hall had turned toward the table where he sat beside his mother. Danaë remained perfectly still, her face composed in the manner of someone who had learned long ago to hide her thoughts behind a mask of serene dignity. But Perseus could see the slight tremor in her hands as they rested upon the polished wood. Rising from his seat with the fluid grace that had always marked his movements, Perseus stepped forward into the circle of torchlight that surrounded the king's throne. His voice, when he spoke, carried clearly through the hall, despite the fact that he made no effort to raise it above its normal tone, for something in his bearing commanded attention as surely as thunder demands acknowledgment from those who hear it rolling across distant hills. He thanked King Polydectes for the honour shown to his mother, but suggested with careful politeness that perhaps such an important decision should not be made in haste. Surrounded by the excitement of wine and celebration, Polydectes smiled with the patient indulgence of a cat watching a mouse venture too far from its hole, and his response carried the subtle menace of someone accustomed to having his wishes transformed into reality through the simple expedient of royal decree. He spoke of having observed Danaë for many months, of having considered his decision with all the gravity it deserved, and of his determination to make her his queen before the next full moon rose over Seriphos. The king's words were phrased as statements of fact rather than requests for permission, and the assembled nobles nodded their approval with the enthusiasm of courtiers who understood which way the wind was blowing. Perseus felt something hot and dangerous building in his chest, a sensation like molten metal being poured into a mould that was not quite large enough to contain it. He had inherited more than divine strength from his immortal father, for along with Zeus's power had come the god's legendary temper, and now that anger began to kindle behind his eyes like flames catching hold of dry kindling, the young hero spoke again, his voice still carefully controlled, but carrying undertones that made several of the guests lean back in their chairs, as if a wild animal had suddenly appeared among the dinner tables. He declared that any man who wished to marry his mother would first need to prove himself worthy of such an honor, and that worthiness could only be demonstrated through deeds that would echo through the ages like the exploits of the great heroes whose stories were sung by poets around fires throughout the Mediterranean world. Perseus suggested that King Polydectes choose some impossible task, some quest so dangerous and demanding that its completion would place him among the ranks of legendary figures like Heracles and Theseus. The trap that Polydectes had been preparing for months snapped shut with the satisfying precision of a mechanism crafted by a master engineer, though to the watching nobles it appeared that the young man had walked into it entirely of his own volition. The waves that night seemed larger than usual, rolling in from the dark expanse of the Mediterranean, with a rhythm that matched the pounding of Perseus' heart as he sat upon the rocky shore where he had spent so many peaceful hours during his childhood. The feast had ended badly, with King Polydectes accepting his challenge with an enthusiasm that had sent cold fingers of dread crawling up Perseus' spine, like spiders seeking dark places to hide. The task the king had chosen was one that no mortal man had ever attempted and survived, for he had commanded Perseus to bring him the head of Medusa, the Gorgon whose gaze could turn living flesh to stone as easily as winter frost transforms flowing water into crystal. The magnitude of his error had become clear to Perseus only after the words had left his lips and could not be called back, like arrows released from a bowstring that fly straight toward their target, regardless of the archer's second thoughts. He had spoken in anger and pride, allowing his emotions to override the caution that 20 years of peaceful life had taught him, and now he faced the prospect of either abandoning his mother to the king's unwelcome attentions, or embarking upon a quest that would almost certainly end with his death in some far-off land where his bones would bleach under foreign skies. Medusa and her sisters dwelt in a realm so distant and terrible that even the most experienced navigators spoke of it only in whispers, if they spoke of it at all. The Gorgons were creatures from the earliest days of the world, when the boundaries between divine and mortal, beautiful and monstrous, had not yet been firmly established by the gods who now ruled from their thrones atop Mount Olympus. To look upon Medusa's face meant instant transformation into cold stone, and the approaches to her lair were said to be littered with the statues of heroes and adventurers who had attempted what Perseus had so rashly promised to accomplish. As he sat watching the moonlight paint silver paths across the restless water, Perseus tried to imagine what it would feel like to turn to stone, whether consciousness would persist for a moment during the transformation, or whether death would come as quickly and mercifully as the snuffing of a candle flame. He thought of his mother waiting in their cottage for his return, probably sitting by her loom and working by lamplight as she did when worries kept sleep at bay, and he wondered if she would understand why he had spoken so foolishly when wisdom would have served them both far better. The young hero had no ship that could carry him across the trackless sea toward Medusa's distant realm, no magic weapons that might protect him from her deadly gaze, and no knowledge of the secret paths that led to the places where monsters dwelt in the shadows between the mortal world and the realm of the gods. He possessed only his strength, his courage, and a determination to protect his mother that burned in his chest like a forge fire that could not be extinguished by any amount of doubt or fear. Yet, as Perseus sat alone beneath the stars that wheeled slowly across the dome of heaven, he began to sense that he was not as isolated as he had first believed. Something in the quality of the darkness around him suggested presences that could not be seen with mortal eyes, and the sound of the waves against the rocky shore seemed to carry whispers in languages older than human speech. The first sign that the gods had taken notice of Perseus' predicament came as a subtle change in the evening light, a shimmer in the air above the harbour that might have been dismissed, as heat waves rising from sun-warmed stone, if not for the unseasonable coolness of the night. Perseus remained seated upon his rocky perch, but his senses, sharpened by years of swimming in dangerous waters and reading the moods of unpredictable seas, detected something approaching that was neither wind nor wave nor any other natural phenomenon he had encountered during his 20 years on Seriphos. The figure that materialized first from the gathering dusk wore the appearance of a tall woman whose grey eyes held depths of wisdom accumulated over countless centuries of watching mortal struggles play out like recurring dreams. Her dark hair was bound back in the manner of someone prepared for battle, and the spear she carried gleamed with a light that seemed to emanate from the metal itself, rather than reflecting illumination from any external source. Perseus knew instinctively that he was in the presence of Athena, goddess of wisdom and warfare, though she had chosen to appear in a form that would not overwhelm his mortal senses with the full glory of her divine nature. Before he could speak or move or even properly process the wonder of what was happening to him, a second figure stepped from the shadows cast by the harbour walls, this one wearing the broad-brimmed hat and winged sandals that marked him as Hermes, messenger of the gods and guide of souls travelling between the world of the living and the shadowy realm of the dead. The god's smile held the kind of mischievous warmth that suggested he found Perseus' situation amusing rather than tragic, though there was kindness beneath the amusement, like sunlight breaking through clouds after a brief summer storm. Athena spoke first, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, yet tempered with a gentleness that reminded Perseus of his mother's tone when she had comforted him during childhood nightmares. The goddess explained that she had been watching his progress with interest, noting how he had grown from a remarkable child into a young man whose potential for greatness was written in every line of his bearing and every choice he had made during his years of peaceful exile. She had seen the trap that King Polydectes had laid for him, and while she could not prevent mortals from making foolish promises driven by pride and anger, she could offer assistance to those whose hearts were pure enough to deserve divine intervention. Hermes laughed with the sound of silver bells ringing in mountain air, and added that Perseus's boast had provided the gods with considerable entertainment during what had otherwise been a rather dull season on Mount Olympus. The young hero's declaration that he would bring back Medusa's head had been bold enough to catch the attention of Zeus himself, who had recognized in his mortal son the same mixture of courage and recklessness that had once led the king of the gods to overthrow his own father and claim dominion over heaven and earth. The two immortals settled themselves upon rocks that had somehow arranged themselves into comfortable seats, as if the very landscape was reshaping itself to accommodate their presence, and they began to speak of the quest that lay ahead with the casual ease of experts discussing a craft they had mastered through eons of practice. They told Perseus of allies he had not known existed and resources that had been hidden from mortal knowledge since the earliest days of the world, painting a picture of possibilities that transformed his hopeless situation into something that might, with sufficient cunning and determination, actually be accomplished. The journey to find the Graeae took Perseus across waters that grew progressively stranger as his small boat moved away from the familiar shipping lanes, where merchants and fishermen pursued their ordinary business. Athena had provided him with a shield polished to mirror brightness, its bronze surface reflecting images with such perfect clarity that it seemed more like captured starlight than worked metal, while Hermes had given him directions spoken in riddles that would have confused any ordinary traveller, but somehow made perfect sense to Perseus As he sailed toward the edge of the known world, the sea itself began to change. As he approached the realm where the Grey Sisters dwelt, its blue deepening to shades of purple and black that suggested depths beyond mortal comprehension. The water moved with currents that followed no natural pattern, swirling in spirals that created whirlpools, leading not down into the ocean floor, but seemingly into other dimensions entirely. Fish that swam in these waters bore no resemblance to any species Perseus had encountered during his years on Seriphos, their scales gleaming with colors that had no names, and their eyes holding intelligence that seemed far too knowing for creatures that had never walked upon dry land. The island where the Grey made their home rose from these uncanny waters, like a tooth jutting from the jaw of some impossibly ancient beast, its rocky shores worn smooth by waves that had been breaking against them since before the first mortals learned to build fires or speak in words, rather than grunts and gestures. No vegetation grew upon this barren land, and no birds nested among its cliffs, for the Grey Sisters had long ago drained all life from their surroundings in their endless quest to peer into futures that remained forever just beyond the reach of their shared vision. Perseus beached his boat upon shores covered with pebbles that clinked together like coins in a miser's purse. Each step he took producing musical notes that seemed to hang in the air longer than physics should have allowed. The path that led inland from the water's edge was worn deep into the stone by countless ages of the sisters pacing back and forth, in their eternal argument over whose turn it was to use their single eye and whose responsibility it was to guard their solitary tooth. The sound of their voices reached him long before he could see their hunched forms huddled around a fire that burned without fuel or smoke, producing flames that gave off light but no warmth and cast shadows that moved independently of the objects that should have created them. The three ancient women were arguing with the petulant intensity of children fighting over a treasured toy, their words sharp as broken glass, and their tone suggesting that this particular dispute had been continuing for several thousand years without reaching any satisfactory resolution. Pemphredo, Enyo, and Dino had been ancient when the world was young, and they had grown more ancient still as centuries accumulated around them, like layers of dust settling upon forgotten artifacts. Their hair was white as sea foam and thin as spider silk, and their skin had the translucent quality of parchment that has been handled by too many readers over too many years. Between them they possessed only one eye and one tooth, which they passed back and forth with movements made clumsy by eons of repetition and mutual resentment. Perseus crept closer to the Grey Sisters' fire, with the stealth he had learned during childhood games of hide and seek among the olive groves of Seriphos, though now the stakes were far higher than the simple pride of avoiding capture by playmates. The three ancient women continued their endless bickering, their voices rising and falling like wind through mountain passes as they disputed which of them had held the eye longest during the previous week, and whether Enyo had been deliberately hogging the tooth during the spring equinox celebration that had taken place some 4 centuries earlier. The young hero positioned himself in the shadows just beyond the circle of firelight, watching as the sisters performed their familiar ritual of passing their shared organs from hand to gnarled hand. Pemphredo currently possessed the eye, which she held cupped in her palm like a precious jewel, using it to peer into the swirling mists that surrounded their island, and occasionally cackling with delight when she glimpsed some particularly interesting fragment of future possibility. Meanwhile, Enyo gnawed thoughtfully on their communal tooth, grinding it against problems of philosophy and prophecy with the methodical persistence of someone who had been contemplating the same questions since before the first human city had risen from primordial swampland. The moment Perseus had been waiting for arrived when Pemphredo, growing tired of her turn with the eye, reached across the fire to hand it to Danaë while simultaneously demanding that Enyo relinquish the tooth. for her own use. In the brief instant when all three sisters were focused on the complicated logistics of their exchange, Perseus darted forward with movements as quick and silent as those of a hunting cat, snatching the eye from Pemphredo's outstretched fingers before any of the ancient women realized what was happening. The reaction was immediate and devastating, like the sound of a mountain avalanche echoing through previously peaceful valleys. All three sisters began to wail in voices that had been honed by millennia of complaint and lamentation, their cries rising to pitches that made the very air around them shimmer with distress. They scrambled about on hands and knees, feeling desperately along the ground for their missing eye, while hurling accusations at each other with venom that could have poisoned entire kingdoms if it had been distilled into liquid form. Perseus stepped into the circle of firelight with the eye held carefully in his closed fist, his voice cutting through their chaos with the calm authority of someone who had been taught good manners by a mother who valued courtesy even in the most trying circumstances. He introduced himself politely and explained that he had borrowed their eye temporarily in order to request information that they alone possessed, assuring them that he would return their precious organ undamaged once they had answered a single question that would help him complete a quest of vital importance. The sisters' wailing ceased abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete that Perseus could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears, like thunder rolling across distant hills. When they spoke again, their voices were low and dangerous, filled with the accumulated anger of beings who had never before been successfully deceived or robbed by any mortal creature, no matter how clever or divinely favored such creatures might believe themselves to be. The negotiations that followed tested Perseus's patience more severely than any physical challenge he had ever faced. For the Grey Sisters proved to be bargainers whose skills had been refined by eons of practice in extracting maximum value from every transaction. They spoke in riddles wrapped inside mysteries, their words dancing around, direct answers like moths, circling a flame without ever quite touching the light they seemed so desperate to reach. Each sister contributed her own particular form of obstruction to the conversation, creating a symphony of evasion that would have frustrated even the most persistent scholar attempting to extract knowledge from unwilling sources. Pemphredo insisted on providing elaborate historical context for every piece of information, recounting events that had occurred during the early days of creation, when gods and titans had battled for supremacy over territories that no longer existed in any recognizable form. Her stories wandered through countless tangents and digressions, touching upon the genealogies of minor deities and the symbolic significance of various flowers that had bloomed in gardens, now buried beneath oceans that had themselves dried up and been replaced by mountain ranges whose peaks touched clouds that had never seen the sun. Enyo, meanwhile, demanded philosophical justification for Perseus' quest, challenging him to explain why he believed himself worthy of divine assistance, and whether his motivations were pure enough to deserve success in an undertaking that had defeated heroes whose names were still spoken with reverence in halls, where poets gathered to share stories of legendary deeds. She questioned every assumption underlying his mission, picking apart his reasoning with the merciless precision of someone who had spent thousands of years learning to detect flaws in logic that escaped less experienced minds. Danaë chose to focus on the practical dangers that awaited any mortal foolish enough to seek out the Gorgons in their distant lair, describing in loving detail the various ways that previous heroes had met their ends during similar quests. She spoke of warriors turned to stone while still wearing expressions of confident determination, of wise men whose last thoughts had been preserved forever in marble faces that continued to gaze sightlessly at wonders they would never again be able to appreciate or understand. But Perseus possessed something that had been inherited from his divine father, along with supernatural strength and courage, a persistence that could outlast even the most determined efforts at evasion and delay. He sat cross-legged before their fire throughout the long night, holding their precious eye in his closed fist, while maintaining the patient courtesy his mother had taught him during childhood lessons in proper behavior. When the sisters paused for breath during their elaborate speeches, he would gently redirect the conversation back toward the information he needed, acknowledging their wisdom while insisting upon answers that would actually prove useful for his purposes. As dawn approached, and the unnatural fires began to dim in anticipation of daylight that never quite reached this shadowy realm, the Grey Sisters finally capitulated to Perseus' combination of politeness and stubborn determination. They told him of the garden where the Hesperides dwelt, those evening nymphs whose beauty rivaled that of the goddesses themselves, and whose magical possessions included items that could protect mortals from dangers that would otherwise prove instantly fatal. The directions they provided were complex beyond ordinary comprehension, involving astronomical calculations and references to stars that were visible only from certain locations at specific times of year. The path to the garden lay through waters that existed between the world of mortals and the realm of the gods, requiring navigation skills that transcended ordinary seamanship and ventured into territories where faith mattered more than experience. The waters that carried Perseus toward the Garden of the Evening, nymphs shimmered with colors that had no names in mortal languages, shifting between shades of gold and purple and deep green like liquid sunset captured in an endless sea. His boat moved without need of wind or oar, guided by currents that responded to intention rather than physical force, carrying him through regions where time flowed differently and distance measured itself in heartbeats rather than miles. The air itself tasted of honey and distant flowers, sweet enough to make ordinary food seem flavorless by comparison. And when he breathed deeply, he could feel something awakening in his chest that might have been homesickness for a place he had never seen. As the garden island rose from these enchanted waters, Perseus understood why poets struggled to find adequate words when attempting to describe the realm of the Hesperides. The trees that covered its gently rolling hills bore fruit that gleamed like captured starlight, their branches heavy with apples that sang soft melodies when evening breezes stirred their golden leaves. Flowers bloomed in perpetual spring along paths paved with stones that had been polished smooth by feet that never grew tired of walking among such perfect beauty, and streams of crystal water wandered through meadows where every blade of grass seemed individually crafted by divine hands. The nymphs themselves appeared as Perseus approached their sacred grove, emerging from behind trees and rising from flower beds like spirits materializing from dreams of paradise. They were sisters born from the marriage of Atlas and Hesperus, their beauty refined by centuries of dwelling in this place, where sunset lasted forever and night never quite arrived to banish the golden light that suffused everything with warmth and gentle radiance. Their voices, when they spoke, harmonized with each other in ways that made ordinary conversation sound like music composed by angels who had never known sorrow or loss. Eagle, whose name meant brightness, stepped forward to greet Perseus with eyes that held depths of compassion, earned through countless encounters with heroes whose quests had brought them to this threshold between mortal struggle and divine peace. Her sisters Erythea, Hesperia, and Arethusa gathered around her, like petals arranging themselves around the center of some impossible flower, their presence creating a sense of completeness that made Perseus feel as if some missing piece of his soul had suddenly been restored to its proper place. The nymphs listened to his story with the patient attention of beings who had heard similar tales from other heroes throughout the long ages of their existence, nodding with understanding when he spoke of his mother's plight and the impossible task that King Polydectes had set before him. They asked no questions about his worthiness or his chances of success, for they could see the divine light that burned within him like a flame that could never be extinguished by wind or rain or the accumulated darkness of mortal fears. Instead, the Hesperides began to speak among themselves in voices so melodious that Perseus found himself growing drowsy despite the urgency of his mission, their words weaving patterns of sound that seemed to carry him toward the edge of sleep where dreams and reality blended together like colors, mixing on an artist's palette. The gifts that the evening nymphs bestowed upon Perseus had been waiting in their garden since before the first mortal hero had ever conceived the notion of challenging the impossible, created by powers older than memory and imbued with magic that drew its strength from the very foundations upon which the world had been built. Aegle led him to a grove, where fruit trees grew in perfect spirals around a pool of water, so clear it seemed like liquid air. And there she showed him treasures that had been hidden from mortal eyes since the early days when gods walked openly among their human children. The first gift was a pair of sandals whose wings fluttered with their own gentle life, crafted from feathers that had been freely given by eagles, who served as messengers to Zeus himself. When Perseus slipped them onto his feet, he felt immediately how they responded to his thoughts rather than his physical movements, lifting him from the ground with effortless grace and allowing him to soar above the garden's golden trees like a bird born to fly through realms that existed beyond the reach of earthbound creatures. The sensation was both exhilarating and peaceful, combining the freedom of flight with the security of knowing that these divine sandals would never falter or fail him during the trials that lay ahead. Arethusa presented him with a cap woven from shadows and starlight, its fabric so fine it seemed to be made from crystallized darkness that had somehow retained the ability to bend and flow like water. When Perseus placed it upon his head, his reflection vanished from the surface of the sacred pool, and even the nymphs found their eyes sliding past him as if he had become part of the evening air itself. The cap of invisibility would allow him to approach dangers that would otherwise detect his presence, long before he could bring his strength and courage to bear against them, transforming him into something like a gentle ghost, capable of moving unseen through realms where visibility meant certain death. The third gift came from Hesperia, who reached into the heart of a tree whose bark gleamed like polished bronze, and withdrew a pouch that seemed larger inside than its external dimensions could possibly accommodate. She explained that this magical container had been crafted by the same divine artisans who had forged the weapons carried by the gods themselves, designed to hold objects that ordinary mortals would find too dangerous or too sacred to touch with unprotected hands. The pouch would expand to contain whatever Perseus needed to carry within it, yet it would never grow heavy or burdensome regardless of the weight or nature of its contents. As the nymphs presented these gifts, Perseus felt a profound sense of gratitude that went deeper than mere appreciation for their material assistance. These immortal beings were offering him tools that represented their own connection to the divine powers that shaped reality, according to laws that transcended mortal understanding, sharing with him magical resources that could not be purchased with gold or won through conquest, but could only be received as freely given gifts from those whose hearts recognized the purity of his intentions. The evening light that perpetually bathed the garden seemed to grow warmer as Perseus accepted each sacred item, and he understood that he was being entrusted with more than mere magical objects. These gifts carried with them the accumulated blessings of beings whose existence was dedicated to maintaining the balance between mortal struggle and divine grace, ensuring that heroes who proved themselves worthy would never face their greatest challenges entirely alone. The messenger god appeared among the golden trees of the Hesperides garden, just as Perseus was preparing to continue his journey toward the realm where the Gorgons dwelt in their terrible isolation. Materializing from the evening air with the casual elegance of someone accustomed to traveling between dimensions, as easily as mortals moved from room to room within their own houses, Hermes carried himself with the relaxed confidence of an immortal being who had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations. Yet his smile held genuine warmth when he looked upon the young hero who had already accomplished so much through determination and divine favor. The god's arrival transformed the peaceful atmosphere of the garden into something charged with anticipation, like the moment before lightning splits a summer sky, though the energy that crackled around Hermes was creative rather than destructive. He moved with fluid grace between the sacred trees, examining the gifts that the nymphs had bestowed upon Perseus, and nodding his approval at their choices with the satisfied expression of someone whose careful plans were unfolding exactly as he had hoped they would. From beneath his traveller's cloak, Hermes withdrew a sword whose blade seemed to have been forged from captured moonlight and tempered in waters that flowed through the heart of creation itself. The weapon's edge held a sharpness that went beyond mere physical keenness, possessing instead a quality that could cut through the barriers between different levels of reality, severing connections that bound the impossible to the merely difficult. When Perseus wrapped his fingers around the sword's hilt, he felt power flowing through the metal-like liquid fire, and he understood that this was no ordinary blade, but something that had been crafted specifically for the task that awaited him. The sword had been forged in the workshops of the gods by artisans whose skills surpassed anything that mortal smiths could hope to achieve. Even with centuries of practice and access to the finest materials that Earth could provide, its metal had been drawn from the core of a fallen star, while its edge had been honed against stones that existed only in the realm of pure mathematics, where abstract concepts took on physical form and could be shaped by those who understood the deeper principles underlying the apparent chaos of mortal existence. Hermes explained that this blade possessed the unique ability to cut through the scales that protected Medusa's neck, scales that had been hardened by divine curse until they were stronger than the bronze shields carried by the greatest warriors of the heroic age. No ordinary weapon could penetrate defenses that had been designed to make the Gorgon invulnerable to any attack launched by mortal hands. But this sword had been imbued with power that drew its strength from the same source that had originally transformed a beautiful woman into a monster whose gaze could turn living flesh to stone. As Perseus accepted this final gift, he felt the weight of destiny settling around him like a cloak woven from starlight and shadow, heavy with responsibility, yet somehow comforting in its solidity. The messenger god spoke quietly of the courage that would be required in the hours ahead, acknowledging that even divine weapons and magical protection could not guarantee success against opponents whose very nature defied the normal rules by which heroes measured their chances of victory. The garden of the Hesperides began to fade around them as Hermes prepared to transport Perseus to the edge of the world where his true test would begin. The golden light growing dim as they moved toward realms where darkness held dominion over territories that had never known the warmth of sunrise. The flight across the void between the garden of eternal evening and the desolate realm where the Gorgons made their home carried Perseus through regions of sky where stars wheeled in patterns that hurt mortal eyes to contemplate for more than a few moments at a time. His winged sandals bore him steadily through this cosmic darkness, their divine feathers navigating currents of wind that blew between worlds and carried the dreams of sleeping gods to destinations that existed beyond the borders of ordinary geography. The cap of invisibility rested upon his head like a crown of concentrated shadow, while the magical pouch hung at his side containing Athena's polished shield and the star-forged sword that would soon taste the blood of creatures born before time learned to measure itself in mortal years. Below him, the landscape gradually transformed from the familiar blues and greens of Mediterranean waters to something that resembled the surface of a moon that had never reflected earthly light. The sea gave way to expanses of grey stone broken by chasms that descended into depths where no sound ever echoed and no living thing had ever drawn breath. Rocky pinnacles jutted upward like the fingers of buried giants, reaching toward a sky that offered no hope of rescue. Their surfaces scoured smooth by winds that carried the whispers of the damned across territories where hope had withered and died countless ages ago. The air itself grew thicker as Perseus approached his destination, taking on a quality that reminded him of the heavy atmosphere that settles over a city just before plague strikes down its inhabitants. Each breath required more effort than the last, as if the very act of respiration was being actively resisted by forces that preferred silence and stillness to the messy vitality of living creatures. The temperature dropped steadily until Perseus could see his own breath forming clouds of vapor that dissipated almost immediately, absorbed by an atmosphere hungry for any trace of warmth or life. Strange lights flickered in the distance, not the cheerful glow of fires built by travelers seeking comfort against the darkness, but cold phosphorescence that emanated from minerals that had been touched by divine curses and transformed into beacons marking the approach to territories where natural law bent beneath the weight of ancient magic. These lights pulsed with rhythms that seemed almost like heartbeats, though Perseus realized with growing unease that they were counting down toward something rather than maintaining the steady tempo of healthy circulation. As the winged sandals carried him deeper into this realm of perpetual twilight, Perseus began to understand why no hero who had attempted this quest had ever returned to tell of his experiences. The very air seemed designed to drain courage from mortal hearts, replacing determination with a creeping despair that whispered of the futility of struggle against powers that had been ancient when the world was young. Yet the divine blood that flowed in his veins provided protection against the worst effects of this supernatural dread, burning like a small flame that refused to be extinguished, no matter how fierce the winds of hopelessness that attempted to snuff it out. The approach to the Gorgon's lair revealed itself gradually through the gloom, a collection of caves carved into cliffs that rose from the barren landscape like monuments to some forgotten catastrophe. The silence that blanketed the Gorgon's realm was unlike anything Perseus had ever experienced, deeper and more complete than the quiet that falls over the sea during those rare moments when wind and wave conspire to create perfect stillness. Here, in this place where the three sisters had made their home since the early days of creation, sound itself seemed reluctant to exist, as if the very molecules of air had been trained to absorb vibration rather than transmit it. Even his own heartbeat, normally as constant and unnoticed as the rhythm of waves against familiar shores, seemed muffled and distant, as though it were beating inside someone else's chest. The landscape stretched before him in undulating waves of grey stone that had been worn smooth by eons of wind carrying no moisture, no seeds, no promise of renewal or change. Nothing grew in this soil that had been salted with tears of rage and watered with blood, spilled during the curse that had transformed beautiful Medusa into the monster she had become. The very ground rejected life with such thoroughness that even the hardiest weeds, those persistent plants that managed to find footing in cracks between cobblestones and along the edges of well-traveled roads, could gain no purchase in earth that had been dedicated to endings rather than beginnings. Perseus descended slowly toward the cluster of caves that pocked the face of an enormous cliff, its surface carved with natural formations that resembled screaming faces frozen in expressions of terminal horror. The winged sandals responded to his thoughts with perfect precision, lowering him through air that grew progressively colder as he approached the openings, where darkness pooled like liquid shadow waiting to swallow anything foolish enough to venture into territories that belonged entirely to nightmare and ancient grudges. The first cave mouth yawned before him like the entrance to some primordial throat, its depths invisible despite the supernatural sharpness of vision that had been granted to him along with his other divine gifts. From within came a sound that was not quite breathing and not quite the rustle of enormous wings, but something that combined elements of both while adding undertones that spoke of scales sliding against stone and claws, scraping against surfaces harder than diamond. The very air that emerged from these depths carried scents of copper and sulfur, mixed with something else that might have been the smell of lightning captured and concentrated, until it could be stored in bottles. As Perseus hovered outside the cave entrance, using the cap of invisibility to shield himself from detection, while he studied the approach to his target, he became aware that he was not entirely alone in this desolate realm. Other presences moved through the shadows cast by rocky outcroppings and wandered along paths that led nowhere except deeper into territories mapped only by despair. These were not living creatures in any sense that mortal minds could comprehend, but rather the accumulated essence of all those who had ventured here before him and failed to complete their quests. The spirits of dead heroes drifted through this landscape, like smoke given form and purpose, their translucent shapes retaining enough of their original appearance to be recognizable as men who had once been renowned for courage and skill in battle. They moved with the aimless persistence of sleepwalkers, forever searching for exits that did not exist from a realm where failure had become the only constant and hope had been ground to dust beneath the weight of impossible expectations. The approach to the deepest cave where Medusa herself dwelt was marked by a garden of stone figures that had once been living men, their marble forms arranged in poses that told the story of their final moments with terrible clarity. Some stood with weapons raised in attitudes of heroic defiance, their bronze swords and iron spears forever poised to strike blows that would never land against an enemy whose very gaze had transformed courage into eternal stillness. Others had been caught in the act of fleeing, their stone legs frozen mid-stride as they attempted to escape a fate that moved faster than any mortal man could run. Perseus moved among these silent sentinels with reverent care, studying their faces to read the expressions that had been preserved for all eternity in cold marble, that captured every detail of their final thoughts. Some showed determination mixed with dawning horror as understanding had begun to penetrate their minds, while others displayed the peaceful acceptance of men who had known from the beginning that their quest would end in death, and had chosen to pursue it anyway because the alternative was to live with the knowledge that they had failed to attempt what honor demanded of them. The statues varied in age from ancient warriors whose bronze armor bore designs that had not been fashionable for centuries, to more recent heroes whose clothing and weapons reflected styles that Perseus recognized from his own time. Each frozen figure represented someone's son or brother or father, men who had left behind families and friends to venture into this realm where courage counted for nothing against powers that predated the establishment of justice and mercy as governing principles of divine law. Their stone eyes stared sightlessly at visions that would remain forever trapped behind marble surfaces, scenes of home and happiness that had become as unreachable as distant stars. Some of the statues bore inscriptions carved into their bases by hands unknown, epitaphs that spoke of noble intentions and pure hearts, of quests undertaken not for personal glory, but for the protection of those who could not protect themselves. Perseus read these words with growing understanding of the magnitude of his own undertaking, recognizing that every man who lay frozen in stone had possessed the same mixture of courage and divine favor that had carried him this far toward his confrontation with the Gorgon who waited in the darkness ahead. As he studied the stone garden, Perseus noticed that the statues had been arranged with a care that suggested someone had taken the time to position them thoughtfully, rather than simply leaving them where they had fallen. The poses complemented each other in ways that created a sense of movement and narrative, as if the entire collection were meant to tell a story about the nature of heroism and the price that must sometimes be paid by those who choose to stand against monsters that threaten the peace of ordinary mortals going about their daily lives. The realization came to him gradually that this arrangement had been created by Medusa herself, that in the long centuries since her transformation, she had developed something resembling affection for the heroes who came to challenge her. Each statue represented not just a victory over another would-be slayer, but also a companion added to her collection of permanent guests, men whose courage had earned them a place in her gallery of beautiful defeats, where they could remain forever young and forever brave, untouched by the aging and decay that eventually claimed all mortals who chose safer paths through life. The cave that housed the three Gorgon sisters opened before Perseus like the mouth of some ancient creature that had swallowed darkness itself and learned to breathe shadows instead of air. His winged sandals carried him silently across the threshold, their divine feathers making no sound against stone floors that had been polished smooth by centuries of serpentine coils sliding across their surface. The cap of invisibility wrapped him in protective darkness, while Athena's shield hung ready at his side, its polished bronze surface reflecting light that came from no visible source, but seemed to emanate from the very walls of this supernatural cavern. The interior of the cave stretched away into distances that defied the laws governing ordinary spaces, its dimensions expanding and contracting according to principles that had nothing to do with mortal geometry, and everything to do with the accumulated weight of divine curses and ancient magic. Formations of crystal grew from floor and ceiling, like frozen waterfalls catching light that had never known the warmth of any earthly sun, their surfaces carved with patterns that told stories in languages older than human speech. The air itself moved with currents that followed no natural pattern, swirling in spirals that carried whispers of conversations held before the first mortal had learned to speak in words rather than gestures. As Perseus ventured deeper into the heart of the cave, guided by instincts that seemed to draw their wisdom from sources beyond his conscious understanding, he began to hear sounds that confirmed he was approaching his destination. The breathing of the three sisters created rhythms that overlapped and intertwined like musical themes. In some cosmic symphony, each inhalation and exhalation marking time, according to cycles that measured themselves in eons rather than moments. Their serpentine hair rustled with movements that suggested dreams filled with images of flight and hunt, while their bronze scales shifted against stone with sounds like distant thunder rolling across horizons that existed only in the realm of sleep. The chamber where the Gorgons rested opened before him, suddenly its vast space illuminated by phosphorescent minerals that had absorbed the glow of their divine essence and now released it in patterns that painted the walls with shifting colors. Steno and Uriel lay coiled upon beds of polished stone, their immortal forms radiating power even in repose, while between them slumbered Medusa herself, the only one of the three sisters who could be killed by mortal weapons, wielded with sufficient skill and divine blessing. Perseus felt his breath catch in his throat as he looked upon the Gorgon who had been the subject of so many nightmares and cautionary tales, told around fires where travelers gathered to share stories of monsters that haunted the edges of the known world. Even in sleep, Medusa retained traces of the beauty that had once made her the most desired priestess in Athena's temple, though that loveliness had been transformed by divine curse into something that combined attraction with terror in ways that mortal minds struggled to comprehend without losing their grip on sanity. Her serpentine hair moved with its own life, the individual snakes that crowned her head swaying in rhythm with her breathing, while their scales caught and reflected the cave's strange light. Her face, turned away from where Perseus stood, frozen at the chamber's entrance, showed features that might have belonged to a goddess, if not for the bronze scales that covered her skin, and the knowledge that her eyes held death for any who dared to meet their gaze directly. Perseus raised Athena's shield with hands that trembled slightly, despite all his divine gifts and mortal courage, angling its polished bronze surface until it showed him Medusa's reflection with perfect clarity, while protecting his eyes from the direct sight that would transform him instantly into one more statue for her collection. The image in the shield revealed details that filled him with unexpected sorrow, for even distorted by the bronze mirror he could see traces of the woman she had once been, the priestess whose only crime had been beauty sufficient to attract the attention of gods who took what they desired without regard for mortal wishes or divine law. The sword that Hermes had given him felt heavier than mountains as Perseus raised it above his head, its star-forged blade catching light from sources that existed beyond the boundaries of normal perception. He moved with steps so careful they seemed to take entire seasons to complete, approaching Medusa's sleeping form, while keeping his gaze fixed upon her reflection and fighting against every instinct that screamed at him to flee from this place, where death waited behind closed eyelids and dreamed of all the heroes it had yet to claim. The serpents that formed her hair began to stir as he drew nearer, sensing presence even in their sleep, and lifting scaled heads to taste air that carried unfamiliar scents of distant islands and mortal determination. Their eyes, smaller versions of their mistress's deadly gaze, opened one by one like malevolent stars appearing in a sky dedicated entirely to endings and farewells. Perseus forced himself to continue moving forward, trusting in the cap of invisibility to shield him from detection, while praying to every god whose name he had ever learned that his courage would not fail him when the moment came to strike. Medusa's breathing changed as consciousness began to return to her immortal mind, her form shifting on the stone bed as dreams of endless solitude gave way to waking awareness that someone had violated the sanctuary where she had rested undisturbed for countless years. Her serpentine hair rose like a crown of living jewels, each individual snake testing the air with forked tongues that searched for traces of the intruder, whose presence they could sense, but could not yet locate with sufficient precision to focus their mistress's deadly attention. Perseus positioned himself beside her sleeping form, raising the divine sword until its point hovered directly above the place where her neck curved into her shoulder, that single vulnerable spot where bronze scales gave way to skin, soft enough to be pierced by a blade forged from fallen stars and tempered in waters that flowed through the heart of creation. In the polished surface of Athena's shield, he watched Medusa's eyes begin to open, their lids lifting slowly as she emerged from dreams that had carried her through centuries of isolation into a waking world where heroes still dared to challenge the impossible. The moment of striking arrived like sunrise breaking over distant mountains, inevitable and brilliant and terrible in its finality. Perseus brought the sword down with all the strength that divine blood had granted him, feeling the blade slice through scales and flesh and bone with surprising ease, while Medusa's eyes opened fully, and her mouth began to form words that would have been either curse or blessing, depending upon the mercy hidden in her transformed heart. The sword completed its arc with a sound like silver bells ringing across vast distances, and Medusa's head separated from her body in a spray of golden ichor that splattered against the cave walls and immediately began to crystallize into formations more beautiful than any earthly jeweler had ever imagined. Her serpentine hair continued to writhe for several moments after the strike, the individual snakes snapping at empty air as if they had not yet understood that their immortal existence had come to an end in a chamber that had witnessed the deaths of so many heroes, but never before the death of a monster. From the severed neck there sprang two creatures that had been waiting within Medusa's immortal form since the day of her transformation. Beings whose existence had been held in suspension by the same divine curse that had changed a beautiful priestess into a creature whose gaze could turn living flesh to stone. Pegasus emerged first, his wings already spread and beating with powerful strokes that sent crystallized ichor scattering like golden snow throughout the chamber. The winged horse's coat shone with luminescence that spoke of divine heritage and untamed skies, while his eyes held intelligence that suggested he understood both his origin and his destiny among the mortals who had always dreamed of flight. The second being to emerge from Medusa's blood was Chrysaor, a giant whose very name meant golden sword, and whose presence filled the cave with energy that made the phosphorescent walls pulse with reflected power. Unlike his brother Pegasus, Chrysaor showed no inclination to flee this place of endings and transformations, but stood regarding Perseus with eyes that held depths of knowledge about divine justice and the price that mortals paid when they accepted quests that carried them into territories where gods conducted their most private business. Perseus moved with speed born of divine inspiration and mortal terror, snatching Medusa's severed head by its serpentine hair and thrusting it immediately into the magical pouch that the Hesperides had given him for precisely this purpose. The bag expanded to accommodate its grisly contents, while protecting Perseus from the deadly gaze that retained its power even after death. For the curse that had transformed Medusa operated according to laws that transcended the normal boundaries between life and death, continuing to function as long as her eyes remained intact and capable of reflecting the divine wrath that had created them. The sound of awakening came from the deeper recesses of the cave, as Theno and Uriel stirred from their immortal slumber, their consciousness returning with the suddenness of lightning-splitting peaceful skies. Their sister's death had sent ripples through whatever connection bound the three Gorgons together, and now they rose from their stone beds with fury that made the very walls of the cavern tremble, as if earthquake had decided to take up permanent residence in this place, where natural law bent beneath the weight of supernatural rage. Perseus felt the winged sandals respond to his desperate need for escape, lifting him from the cave floor just as the two surviving Gorgons burst into the chamber where their sister's body lay surrounded by pools of crystallizing ichor and the lingering scent of divine intervention. Their voices, when they discovered what had transpired, rose in harmonized screams that shattered crystal formations and sent cracks racing through stone that had stood unchanged since the early days of creation, when Titans had walked the earth, and gods had not yet learned to hide their conflicts behind veils of metaphor and symbol. The pursuit that followed would test every gift that Perseus had received from his divine benefactors, as two immortal creatures whose grief had transformed itself into something approaching absolute fury gave chase through realms where the normal rules governing speed and distance held no meaning. The winged sandals carried Perseus through air that had become charged with the electrical fury of the pursuing Gorgons, their divine feathers working harder than they ever had before, as they navigated winds that seemed determined to blow him back toward the claws and fangs that snapped at empty space just behind his heels. Athena and Uriel flew with the relentless persistence of grief-given wings, their immortal forms cutting through the atmosphere like arrows shot from bows strung by gods who had never learned the meaning of mercy or forgiveness. Their serpentine hair streamed behind them in configurations that defied every law governing wind resistance, while their bronze scales caught and reflected light from sources that existed beyond the normal spectrum of mortal vision. The landscape below blurred past in patterns of grey stone and empty sky as Perseus pushed his divine gifts to their absolute limits. The cap of invisibility providing some protection from direct pursuit, while the magical pouch containing Medusa's head bounced against his side with weight that seemed to increase with every league he travelled. Behind him, the voices of the surviving sisters rose in harmonies that made mountains tremble and caused stars to dim in sympathy for losses that transcended the normal boundaries between personal grief and cosmic catastrophe. As the chase continued through regions where geography became fluid, and distance measured itself in emotional states rather than physical miles, Perseus began to understand that simple flight would not be sufficient to escape creatures whose fury operated according to principles that had nothing to do with mortal limitations. The Gorgons were gaining ground, despite the supernatural speed of his winged sandals, their immortal strength proving superior to even the finest gifts that gods could bestow upon favored mortals who found themselves caught between impossible tasks and the consequences of divine politics. The solution came to him suddenly, inspired by memories of childhood games played among the olive groves of Seriphos, where hide and seek had taught him lessons about misdirection and the art of becoming invisible not through magical means, but through clever use of terrain and timing. Rather than continuing to flee in a straight line that allowed his pursuers to anticipate his movements, Perseus began to weave unpredictable patterns through the air, diving toward rocky outcroppings and soaring up toward cloud formations, while using every trick of aerial navigation that instinct and desperation could teach him. The chase led them over territories that existed at the very edge of the mortal world, places where reality grew thin and began to blend with the realm of dreams and divine imagination. Here, islands floated in mid-air without any visible means of support, while rivers flowed upward from their sources toward destinations that might have been other planets or simply different states of consciousness. The very atmosphere seemed designed to confuse pursuit, filled with mirages that showed multiple versions of the same landscape and echoes that carried sounds across impossible distances. Perseus felt the gap between himself and his pursuers beginning to widen as the Gorgons found their own movements hampered by the strange physics of this borderland region, their rage proving less effective as a means of propulsion when directed against targets that kept vanishing behind curtains of shifting possibility. The winged sandals carried Perseus through air that had become charged with the electrical fury of the pursuing Gorgons, their divine feathers working harder than they ever had before, as they navigated winds that seemed determined to blow him back toward the claws and fangs that snapped at empty space just behind his heels. Athena and Uriel flew with the relentless persistence of grief-given wings, their immortal forms cutting through the atmosphere like arrows shot from bows strung by gods who had never learned the meaning of mercy or forgiveness. Their serpentine hair streamed behind them in configurations that defied every law governing wind resistance, while their bronze scales caught and reflected light from sources that existed beyond the normal spectrum of mortal vision. The landscape below blurred past, in patterns of grey stone and empty sky, as Perseus pushed his divine gifts to their absolute limits, the cap of invisibility providing some protection from direct pursuit, while the magical pouch containing Medusa's head bounced against his side with weight that seemed to increase with every league he travelled. Behind him, the voices of the surviving sisters rose in harmonies that made mountains tremble and caused stars to dim in sympathy for losses that transcended the normal boundaries between personal grief and cosmic catastrophe. As the chase continued through regions where geography became fluid and distance measured itself in emotional states rather than physical miles, Perseus began to understand that simple flight would not be sufficient to escape creatures whose fury operated according to principles that had nothing to do with mortal limitations. The Gorgons were gaining ground despite the supernatural speed of his winged sandals, their immortal strength proving superior to even the finest gifts that gods could bestow upon favoured mortals who found themselves caught between impossible tasks and the consequences of divine politics. The solution came to him suddenly, inspired by memories of childhood games played among the olive groves of Seriphos, where hide and seek had taught him lessons about misdirection and the art of becoming invisible not through magical means, but through clever use of terrain and timing, rather than continuing to flee in a straight line that allowed his pursuers to anticipate his movements. Perseus began to weave unpredictable patterns through the air, diving toward rocky outcroppings and soaring up toward cloud formations, while using every trick of aerial navigation that instinct and desperation could teach him. The chase led them over territories that existed at the very edge of the mortal world, places where reality grew thin and began to blend with the realm of dreams and divine imagination. Here, islands floated in mid-air without any visible means of support, while rivers flowed upward from their sources toward destinations that might have been other planets or simply different states of consciousness. The very atmosphere seemed designed to confuse pursuit, filled with mirages that showed multiple versions of the same landscape and echoes that carried sounds across impossible distances. Perseus felt the gap between himself and his pursuers beginning to widen as the Gorgons found their own movements hampered by the strange physics of this borderland region, their rage proving less effective as a means of propulsion when directed against targets that kept vanishing behind curtains of shifting possibility. The coastline that emerged from the haze of Perseus's desperate flight appeared at first to be nothing more than another stretch of barren rocks, rising from wine-dark waters. But as he descended toward what he hoped might provide temporary refuge from his immortal pursuers, details began to resolve themselves that spoke of human tragedy unfolding according to patterns older than civilization itself. Chains of bronze, green with the patina of years spent exposed to salt spray and Mediterranean winds, had been hammered into the living rock of a cliff that faced the open sea, where monsters were said to rise from depths that had never known sunlight. Bound within these chains was a young woman whose beauty rivaled that of the goddesses themselves, though her loveliness had been transformed by terror and despair into something that broke Perseus's heart, even as he marveled at the graceful lines of her form, and the way her dark hair moved in the sea breeze, like silk banners announcing the presence of royalty in exile. Her clothing, though torn and stained by exposure to the elements, bore the fine embroidery and rich dyes that marked her as princess or queen, someone whose blood carried the weight of ancient dynasties and whose fate would be remembered in songs long after lesser mortals had been forgotten by history. The young woman looked up at Perseus's approach with eyes that held depths of resignation mixed with desperate hope. as if she had long since abandoned expectation of rescue, but could not entirely extinguish the spark of possibility that divine intervention might yet alter the trajectory of her seemingly inevitable doom. When she spoke, her voice carried the cultured tones of someone raised in palaces where education was considered as important as beauty, and where young women learned to face catastrophe with dignity that would honor their ancestors even in the moment of ultimate defeat. She identified herself as Andromeda, daughter of King Cepheus and Queen Cassiopeia of Ethiopia, whose fate had been sealed by her mother's boastful claim that her daughter's beauty surpassed that of the sea nymphs who served as companions to Poseidon himself. The god of earthquakes and ocean storms had responded to this insult with the fury that immortals reserved for mortals who dared to suggest that human perfection could rival divine beauty, sending a sea monster from the deepest trenches to ravage the Ethiopian coast, until Andromeda was offered as sacrifice to appease his wounded pride. Perseus felt the weight of recognition settling over him like a cloak woven from destiny and divine coincidence, understanding that his arrival at this particular place and time was no accident, but rather part of a pattern that had been woven by powers far greater than his own consciousness could comprehend. The magical pouch at his side seemed to pulse with its own awareness, as if Medusa's severed head understood that its deadly power was about to be called upon once more to transform catastrophe into triumph and death into deliverance. The sound that rose from the waters below was like nothing Perseus had ever heard before. A combination of whale song and earthquake that announced the approach of something vast and ancient and utterly hostile to every form of life that drew breath above the surface of the sea. Waves began to build in patterns that defied natural explanation, rising in spirals and geometric forms that spoke of intelligence directing forces that should have been governed only by wind and tide and the gravitational pull of distant moons. From the depths where sunlight had never penetrated, and pressure crushed ordinary matter into forms that existed at the very edge of physical possibility, Cetus began its ascent toward the surface where a sacrifice waited in chains that had been blessed by priests who understood the proper rituals for appeasing divine wrath. The creature that emerged from these abyssal regions bore only passing resemblance to any monster that mortal imagination had ever conceived, for it had been shaped by forces that operated according to principles that predated the establishment of natural law and the division of reality into categories that human minds could comfortably process. The first sign of its approach was the way the water itself began to change color, shifting from the familiar blue-green of Mediterranean shallows to shades of purple and black that suggested depths beyond measurement or comprehension. The sea developed a luminescence that came not from reflected sunlight, but from some internal source that pulsed with rhythms matching the creature's vast heartbeat, creating patterns of light that moved across the surface, like aurora dancing in regions where magnetic fields bent according to the will of gods, rather than the laws of physics. Perseus positioned himself between the chained princess and the roiling waters where shapes moved beneath the surface with purpose that spoke of intelligence older than human civilization and hungrier than any earthly predator. The winged sandals held him steady against winds that had begun to blow in directions that existed only in the realm of nightmare, while the cap of invisibility provided protection against senses that operated through means more sophisticated than simple sight or sound or smell. When Cetus finally breached the surface, the displacement of water created waves that crashed against the cliffs with force sufficient to shake foundations that had stood unchanged since the early days of creation. The monster's head rose from the churning foam like a mountain emerging from primordial chaos, covered with scales that reflected light in patterns that hurt mortal eyes to observe directly. Its mouth opened to reveal rows of teeth that had been carved from materials harder than diamond and sharper than the edge of winter wind, while its eyes held intelligence that had been accumulating knowledge since before the first star learned to burn with nuclear fire. The creature's body remained mostly submerged as it approached the cliff where Andromeda waited in chains that suddenly seemed as fragile as spider silk when measured against the power that surged through muscles designed to crush islands and swallow ships without noticing their passage. Tentacles thick as ancient trees emerged from the water to test the rocky face of the cliff, leaving marks in solid stone that spoke of strength capable of reshaping coastlines, according to whims that mortals could never hope to understand or predict. Perseus drew the divine sword that Hermes had given him, its star-forged blade singing with anticipation as it tasted air that had become charged with the electrical potential of impending conflict between mortal courage and divine wrath. The weapon seemed to grow lighter in his grip as he prepared to engage an opponent whose very existence challenged every assumption about the proper relationship between heroes and the monsters they were destined to face. For this creature had been sent not by chance or evil intent, but by a god whose anger operated according to justice that transcended human concepts of fairness and mercy. The first strike came not from Perseus's blade, but from Cetus itself, as the sea monster launched itself partially from the water with movements that defied every law governing creatures of such impossible size and mass. Its tentacles whipped through the air where Perseus had been hovering just moments before, missing him only because the winged sandals responded to danger faster than conscious thought could process the threat. The creature's roar shook the very foundations of the cliff where Andromeda remained chained, her voice joining the monster's cry in harmonies of terror that seemed to summon sympathetic responses from storms gathering on distant horizons. Perseus found himself fighting not just a single opponent, but an entire environment that had been transformed by Cetus's presence into something actively hostile to human survival. The air itself had become thick as honey, requiring tremendous effort from his divine sandals to maintain altitude and maneuverability, while the electromagnetic disturbances radiating from the creature's scaled hide interfered with his ability to judge distance and direction with the precision that aerial combat demanded. Salt spray rose from the churning waters in clouds, so dense they created their own weather patterns, generating lightning that crackled between Perseus and his target, with energies borrowed from the deepest ocean trenches. The battle that followed resembled a dance more than a conventional fight, with Perseus weaving intricate patterns through three-dimensional space, while Cetus responded with movements that combined the fluid grace of sea creatures with the devastating power of geological forces unleashed without restraint. Each time the hero dove toward the monster with his divine sword extended, tentacles thick as ship masts would converge on his position with speed that made mockery of their apparent bulk, forcing him to twist away at the last possible moment while seeking opportunities to land meaningful strikes against hide that seemed proof against any earthly weapon. The breakthrough came when Perseus realized that conventional tactics designed for fighting earthbound opponents were useless against a creature whose very nature operated according to oceanic principles of fluid movement and distributed awareness. Instead of attempting to engage Cetus directly in the manner of heroes facing dragons or giants, he began to use the monster's own momentum against it, allowing its attacks to carry it into positions where its vast bulk became a disadvantage rather than an asset. The winged sandals carried him through maneuvers that would have been impossible for any creature bound by normal limitations, creating opportunities for strikes that appeared suddenly and vanished just as quickly. When his blade finally found its mark, sliding between scales that had been momentarily separated by the creature's own violent movements, Perseus felt the shock of contact travel up through the divine metal into his arms and shoulders with force that numbed his entire body. Cetus's response was immediate and catastrophic, its death throes sending waves crashing against the cliffs with such violence that entire sections of rock face crumbled into the churning foam below, while its final roar echoed across waters that would carry the sound to distant shores where fishermen would speak in whispers of the day. The sea itself had screamed in pain. The silence that followed the sea monster's death felt almost supernatural in its completeness, broken only by the gentle sound of waves returning to their natural rhythm, as if the ocean itself were sighing with relief at the passing of something that had disturbed its peace for far too long. Perseus descended slowly toward the cliff where Andromeda remained secured by chains that had somehow survived the violent shaking of Cetus's final moments. Though several of the bronze links showed stress fractures that spoke eloquently of forces that had come close to destroying everything in their vicinity. As he worked to free the princess from her bonds, using the divine sword to slice through metal that had been forged by craftsmen who understood the proper techniques for creating restraints that could hold prisoners intended for sacrifice to angry gods, Perseus found himself studying her face with attention that went far beyond simple concern for her physical welfare. Something in her expression, a combination of gratitude and wonder and courage that had survived intact despite the terror she had endured, spoke to parts of his heart that had remained dormant during his years of peaceful exile on Seriphos. Andromeda, meanwhile, watched this young hero who had appeared from nowhere to battle a monster that even the bravest warriors of her father's kingdom had refused to face, noting details that would remain etched in her memory long after the immediate crisis had passed into the realm of stories told around palace fires. The way he moved spoke of training that went beyond anything mortal teachers could provide, while the gentleness with which he handled her bruised wrists suggested a character that had been shaped by influences far more refined than the typical education received by warriors who made their living through violence and conquest. When the last chain fell away and Andromeda stood free for the first time in weeks, she found herself unable to step away from this stranger who had risked everything to save her life without any promise of reward or recognition. Their eyes met and held with intensity that made the air around them seem to shimmer with possibilities that neither had anticipated when this day began with such different expectations. Perseus felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of what constituted a life worth living, while Andromeda discovered that rescue could involve far more than simple liberation from physical danger. The conversation that followed moved through territories that neither had explored before, touching upon dreams and fears and hopes with the kind of honesty that usually develops only after years of shared experience and mutual trust. They spoke of loneliness that comes from being different, of responsibilities that feel too heavy for mortal shoulders to bear, and of the strange ways that destiny weaves patterns connecting lives that seem to have nothing in common except the courage to continue moving forward, despite uncertainty about what lies ahead. As the sun began its descent toward horizons painted in shades of gold and crimson, Perseus realized that his quest had brought him something far more valuable than the mere completion of an impossible task. In saving Andromeda's life, he had discovered the missing piece of his own existence, the companion whose presence would transform solitary heroism into something richer and more meaningful than any achievement that could be measured in terms of monsters defeated or treasures won. The journey back to Seriphos took place across waters that seemed calmer than Perseus remembered from his outward voyage, as if the successful completion of his quest had somehow pacified the very elements that had once threatened to overwhelm his small boat with storms born from divine displeasure and mortal presumption. Andromeda sat beside him in the vessel that had been enlarged through application of the same divine principles that governed the magical pouch containing Medusa's head. her presence transforming what had begun as a desperate flight from impossible circumstances into something that felt more like a celebration of victories that extended far beyond the simple defeat of monsters. They sailed through regions where dolphins gathered to escort their passage, playing in the wake of their boat with enthusiasm that suggested these intelligent creatures understood they were accompanying heroes whose adventures would be remembered long after the last wave had washed against the last shore. The very winds seemed to blow in their favor, filling their simple sail with power that carried them homeward at speeds that defied the modest capabilities of their craft, while seabirds called out greetings in languages that had been learned during conversations with gods, who sometimes chose to travel in feathered form. As the familiar outline of Seriphos emerged from the haze of distance, Perseus felt his heart growing heavy with anticipation of confrontations that would test diplomatic skills he had never been required to develop during his years of peaceful exile among the island's fishing community. King Polydectes would be expecting him to return either as a statue suitable for display in some royal garden, or not at all, and the sight of Perseus approaching the harbour very much alive and accompanied by a princess, whose beauty rivaled that of Helen herself, would likely provoke reactions that might prove more dangerous than anything he had faced during his encounters with Grey Sisters and Gorgons. The harbour of Seriphos appeared strangely quiet as their boat approached the familiar stone pier where Perseus had learned to tie proper knots and mend nets during childhood afternoons that now seemed to belong to someone else's memories. No fishing boats bobbed at their moorings, and no children played among the tide pools, where he had once searched for seashells and pieces of coloured glass, polished smooth by countless years of wave action. Even the gulls that usually filled the air with their raucous cries seemed subdued, as if some shadow had fallen across the island during his absence and transformed its cheerful bustle into something that resembled a community holding its breath in anticipation of disasters that had not yet arrived, but could no longer be avoided. Dictys appeared on the pier as Perseus secured their boat, with movements made automatic by years of practice. But the fisherman's face showed an expression that mixed relief with concern, in proportions that made Perseus's stomach tighten with dread. The old man's first words confirmed fears that had been growing during the final hours of their homeward journey, as he spoke of changes that had taken place on Seriphos during the weeks that Perseus had been away pursuing Medusa through realms that existed at the very edge of mortal possibility. The king had grown tired of waiting for Perseus to return as a statue, or fail to return at all, and had decided to proceed with his courtship of Danaë using methods that relied more heavily on royal decree than on romantic persuasion. Setting a wedding date that would arrive with the next full moon, whether the bride consented to the arrangement or not. The great hall of King Polydectes' palace blazed with torchlight, and rang with forced merriment as Perseus made his way through corridors that had once seemed welcoming, but now felt charged with the tension that precedes storms capable of reshaping entire coastlines. The wedding feast was already in progress, with tables groaning under the weight of roasted meats and amphoras of wine that had been brought from the mainland to celebrate what the king proclaimed would be the most joyous occasion in the history of Seriphos. Yet beneath the surface gaiety, Perseus could sense undercurrents of unease among the assembled guests, many of whom remembered the young hero's departure and had not expected to see him return alive from a quest that had defeated every previous challenger. Danaë sat at the high table beside King Polydectes, her posture maintaining the dignity that had sustained her through years of exile and hardship, though Perseus could see the strain in her eyes and the way her hands remained motionless in her lap, as if she dared not risk any gesture that might be interpreted as either acceptance or defiance of her circumstances. She wore a gown of deep purple silk that the king had commissioned for the occasion, its rich fabric and golden embroidery speaking of wealth and power, while somehow making her appear smaller and more fragile than Perseus had ever seen her during their simple life in the fisherman's cottage by the harbour. The reaction that swept through the hall when Perseus appeared in the doorway was like wind moving through a field of grain, a visible wave of surprise and whispered speculation that travelled from table to table until even the musicians paused in their playing to stare at the young man who had been presumed dead for weeks. King Polydectes rose slowly from his throne, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, anger, and calculation as he attempted to process the implications of Perseus's return, and the presence of the stunningly beautiful woman who stood beside him with the bearing of royalty. Perseus walked through the suddenly silent hall, with steps that seemed to echo louder than thunder rolling across distant mountains. The magical pouch containing Medusa's head hidden beneath his cloak, while his hand rested casually on the hilt of the divine sword that had already tasted monster blood and hungered for more. He moved with the fluid confidence of someone who had faced terrors that existed beyond the nightmares of ordinary mortals, and emerged victorious through a combination of divine favour and courage that had been tested in crucibles where lesser heroes had been reduced to stone statues or scattered ashes. When he reached the space before the king's throne, Perseus spoke in a voice that carried clearly to every corner of the hall, despite its conversational tone, announcing that he had returned from his quest successful and bearing the gift that had been demanded of him. The words hung in the air like incense rising from temple altars, heavy with meanings that extended far beyond their surface significance, while King Polydectes struggled to maintain his composure in the face of a development that threatened to transform his moment of triumph into something far more complicated and potentially dangerous. The unveiling of Medusa's head brought silence to the wedding feast that was deeper and more complete than any quiet Perseus had experienced since his journey to the realm where the Gorgons dwelt in their eternal isolation from the world of living things. As he drew the severed head from its magical containment, careful to keep his own eyes averted while directing its deadly gaze toward King Polydectes and the assembled courtiers who had supported his forced marriage to Danaë, Perseus felt the weight of destiny settling around him like a cloak woven from the threads of prophecies spoken by oracles whose words carried the authority of divine truth. The transformation that followed was both instantaneous and strangely beautiful, as the king and his supporters became living marble with expressions of shock and outrage preserved forever in stone that would outlast the memories of their earthly ambitions and petty cruelties. The hall filled with statues that captured the final moments of lives spent in pursuit of power and pleasure, their frozen forms serving as monuments to the folly of those who believe themselves exempt from the justice that governs the relationship between mortals and the divine forces that shape their destinies according to patterns too vast for human comprehension. When Perseus finally returned Medusa's head to its protective pouch, and looked around the hall where his mother sat unharmed among tables filled with marble guests, he felt a profound sense of completion that went beyond mere satisfaction at having rescued her from an unwanted marriage. The quest that had begun with a rash promise made in anger had evolved into something far more significant, a journey that had transformed him from an exile's son into a hero whose deeds would be remembered in songs that had not yet been composed by poets who had not yet been born. The celebration that followed was quieter, but infinitely more meaningful than the forced gaiety that had characterized Polydectes' wedding feast. As the people of Seriphos emerged from hiding places where they had waited for the outcome of confrontations they dared not witness directly, Dictys, now freed from his brother's tyranny, was acclaimed as the new king by unanimous consent of the island's inhabitants, who recognized in the gentle fisherman qualities of leadership that had nothing to do with royal blood and everything to do with the wisdom that comes from treating others with kindness and respect. Perseus and Andromeda were married in a ceremony that took place on the beach where he had once sat alone contemplating an impossible quest. Their vows, spoken as waves, whispered against shores that had witnessed the arrival of a divine child, and now celebrated his transformation into a man whose courage had been tested in crucibles where lesser mortals would have been consumed by forces beyond their ability to comprehend or control. The wedding was blessed by Athena herself, who appeared in the form of a great owl whose cry echoed across waters that would carry news of their union to distant lands, where future generations would tell stories of love that had grown from the seeds of heroism and divine intervention. Yet even as Perseus basked in the happiness of new love and the satisfaction of completed quests, the shadow of ancient prophecy continued to darken corners of his consciousness, like storm clouds gathering on horizons that seemed impossibly distant, yet somehow inevitable. The oracle's words spoken to his grandfather, King Acrisius, so many years ago remained unfulfilled, waiting with the patience that belongs only to fate itself for the moment, when coincidence and circumstance would combine to bring about the doom that had been foretold since before Perseus drew his first breath in the bronze tower, where his mother had been imprisoned by fear and desperation. And so our journey through the moonlit realm of Perseus and Medusa draws to its gentle close, like waves retreating from sandy shores where children have built castles that will stand until morning comes to reshape the landscape with new possibilities. We have followed our hero from his divine birth in a tower of bronze to his triumph over monsters that existed beyond the boundaries of mortal imagination, watching as love bloomed in the most unlikely circumstances and justice found expression through deeds that will echo through eternity like songs carried on winds that never cease their wandering. The ancient prophecy still waits in shadows, patient as tides that know their time will come when stars align in configurations that have been written since the world learned to spin on its axis. But tonight, in this drowsy space between waking and dreams, Perseus rests safely in the arms of love earned through courage, while Medusa's head sleeps peacefully in its magical pouch, its deadly power transformed into protection for those who understand that even monsters once knew beauty. Let these images carry you toward your own peaceful slumber, dear listener, where heroes walk through gardens planted with starlight, and every quest ends not with conquest, but with the quiet satisfaction of duties fulfilled and hearts made whole. The Mediterranean waves continue their eternal rhythm against shores that have witnessed miracles, and in their gentle music you may find the lullaby that guides you safely through the night toward dreams of your own divine adventures. Sleep well, and may your rest be blessed with visions of golden rain and winged sandals, of love that conquers impossibility and courage that transforms the world one heroic deed at a time.